Secretary Cuccinelli, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you with us today. And we want to ask if you'll just give us some opening comments on the importance of state government and your experience as a state government elected official, and then we'll go to questions. And you're muted.
It's the inevitable first mistake. Kathy, thank you for having me back. It's great to be with all of you and your panelists as well again. I am going to talk primarily from my experience as a state senator and state attorney general, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions any of you all may have. I have lived in Virginia almost my entire life, and when I was just turned 34, won a race, a special election to go into Virginia State Senate. In our state, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, service in the legislature is part-time, which means that I kept my day job, which is attorney. I went to engineering school, you heard. The way I tell it is before I went to the dark side and went to law school, I was an engineer. And that background has continued to serve me well, including in government. But at that time, I was a practicing attorney. And so as I began working in the state Senate, our sessions are supposed to be about 2 months long a year. Sometimes they get dragged out. But needless to say, I was a litigator, so I was supposed to be going to court and doing other things and juggling that schedule while trying to legislate on behalf of, for us at that time, was about 200,000 constituents, so about a third of a congressional district. And I was there for 8 years before I became the Attorney General of Virginia. And in Virginia, the Attorney General is elected statewide. That's not true in every state. Let's see, Lacey's in New Jersey. New Jersey does not elect their Attorney General, just to use one example. There, the Attorney General is appointed by the governor, much like New Hampshire and Tennessee. It's picked by, I want to say, the legislature, as it is done in Maine. So it's not the same everywhere. So I was a popularly elected Attorney General in Virginia after serving in the state Senate. So just to give you a time frame, I was elected to the state Senate in 2002, and I assumed office in the Attorney General's office in 2010 for 4 years. And so I literally left the Attorney General's office 10 years ago and a couple of months. So it's that time frame. And while I was in the state Senate, one of the things, I already knew it, but it's different when you live through it versus learn about it. It's the difference between taking a class on government and going and working in government. You learn a lot more about government actually doing, rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty. And one of the things that I found that's relevant to the discussion of federalism is how much the federal government dictates to states what they must or must not do in ways that tie the hands of the states. And you'll often hear these called mandates, and it took me a little while to figure this out, but there actually are almost no mandates by the federal government. What there are is conditions on getting their money. If you want the federal money, you have to do this, 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 and this. And that list, by the way, when you say, well, yeah, we'll do that, then the list grows. It goes from 5 things to 50 things to 500 things. And pretty soon you don't have control of your own state government anymore because you're essentially dictated to by the requirements associated with the federal dollars. 49 of the 50 states have balanced budget requirements of one kind or another. I hope that makes sense to you all. You have to balance your own budget. Any business you're associated with will have to balance its budget. State governments have to balance their budget. The federal government literally prints money, and it has been overspending its revenue since the 1990s. The last time that the budget was actually balanced was in the 1990s, when Newt Gingrich was Speaker and Bill Clinton was president. I believe was the last time you can find the balanced budget. And they use that money to control state behavior, frankly, whether that's in healthcare, through Medicaid, which is the government assistance to poor people for healthcare, or education through special education plans. And really, they just send the money down the line. And if you want the money, you have to do these things. And they're things that we would basically do ourselves anyway, our own way, but instead we have to do them the Washington way. So as you can tell, I have a bit of a bias from the state perspective, and I don't think the federal government adds much value to how we take care of poor people in Virginia's healthcare, or how we take care of kids who need special educational considerations in Virginia. I've never seen them add anything of meaningful value that we wouldn't have already done ourselves. The states are supposed to be laboratories of democracy, and to the extent we're left free to try things differently, how we teach kids, how we let parents teach kids, for instance, with school choice, then the parents are in control. And we can go around the horn. Elections is an area I work in quite a bit. All 50 states and the District of Columbia run their elections different from one another. That's not a bad thing. They've grown up over years, and Virginia thinks there's a particularly better way to do A, B, or C, or how long we should vote, how much early voting we should have. It is okay to do things differently. The founders expected the states who were sovereigns. The states made the federal government, not the other way around. People in our day and age have forgotten that. The states were the originators of the United States of America. And the founders expected us to do things vastly differently from state to state, and that people who felt strongly about that would go move to the state where things were done the way they liked it. Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the most quotable president we've ever had. And one of my favorite fun quotes from Abraham Lincoln is that people who like that sort of thing will find that the sort of thing they like. And it's a, humorous way of just observing that you like what you like, I like what I like, and that's okay. Unfortunately, it is often among elected officials in Washington, when they believe they have sufficient power, they try to dictate to the states their way of doing things. And there are lots of issues I could throw out there that everybody on here would disagree vehemently over, whether it's how big government should be in the first place, whether it's abortion, guns. I mean, the list of hot button issues goes on. And the founders expected us, by and large, to resolve those issues within our states, and that people would go live where they were most comfortable with how the governance and, frankly, the culture of that state took place. And I actually believe there'd be a lot more civility in the political arena if government had less power. The reason every election feels like life or death is because, in terms of holding power, it is. If government had less power, and that means that it gets pushed down from the federal government to the states, and that the states decide how much the local governments will carry responsibility for, then you tend to solve problems more at a local level. I'll use an example. I'm pro free market capitalism, very strongly so. I want to see a very uninvolved government, federal and state, and just let people do business. In Sweden, they're a socialist country. They have government-run healthcare, but they do it an interesting way to impose some accountability. One person from the government has 10,000 people that they're responsible for. And all 10,000 of those people know who's responsible for how well their healthcare works. So you can bet that that man or woman gets people showing up on their doorstep complaining about how long it takes to get a doctor's appointment or do what have you. Well, that's a very local way of handling something they think government should run. I don't think government should run it, but it still makes it very locally accountable. And by doing things that way in this country, I think we could gain more civility. There'd be less to fight about in every federal election because the differences would be allowed to play out in states. And again, that's okay. It's not bad to be different. It's good to be different and to allow the flexibility for people to be different and to believe different things and to live with people who feel similarly. So having said that, and sort of offered that philosophy, I would just make one observation. When I was in the state Senate, part-time, remember, we're not there all year round in Virginia. I thought that the government didn't run very well. And it's hard for government, frankly, to run very well. Again, the founders didn't really expect it to be all that efficient. So I ran for attorney general, and then I was the lawyer for every government agency in Virginia. And Virginia employed at that time about 120,000 employees. We're the 12th largest state. And when you're the lawyer at the table for everything going on, you see a lot more detail than a state senator sees. And I had no idea just how badly things were running. It was worse than I thought. Just inefficient, ineffective, people not all that concerned with waste. And, that's the way government tends to function. I did, of course, everything I could to help fix that and to ameliorate that. But at that level, representing the state, I was actually doing battle with the federal government in court when I felt like what I told you earlier are often called mandates, were illegal, where they were overreaching. And I won some of those cases. The Obamacare case was filed. That was a close call when it was all said and done, 5-4. The EPA was another case where I actually argued the case and won. And we dealt with a number of federal agencies. And so the federal sovereign actually does a little bit of battle with the state sovereigns in court to continually feel out what are the legal boundaries of each level of government's authority. And that was the role I played as Attorney General, is one of the roles I played as Attorney General. But in the ongoing evolution of American federalism, that was a pretty important role. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions or on these subjects or any others, but I'll turn it back over to you all, Kathy.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your service to our Commonwealth and to our country. And I remember when you were Attorney General, you definitely put a boundary around Virginia, and we're part of a great many court cases trying to keep the national government from encroaching into areas where they shouldn't be. And so thank you for those opening comments. Great summary. And I'm going to turn it over to Janine. Janine, I know you've got some questions.
Great. And we say General Cuccinelli, yes? Is that what we say when you're the former Attorney General?
The attorneys general love general. The formal title is Attorney General. I joke with people, I'm a little sensitive in a state with a lot of actual generals that earn that title with bullets flying around.
Right.
But
and I think we're starting my clock. Oh, it's way over there. I can't see it. Okay. But how is just so we learn, we have a lot of students on the show.
Right.
So if you have been, and I've learned a lot of this from Kathy, if you have been, or you are an Attorney General, or you've been a former Attorney General,
right,
the way to address you is Attorney General Cuccinelli or General Cuccinelli. How is it? What is it supposed to be?
The formal address is Attorney General, but But
Okay.
in practice, people say general. It's
Okay.
pretty rare.
Well, that's good.
When letters are written, they'll write out Attorney General. But in ordinary address, in conversation, it's usually just done informally as general fill in the blank.
That's
And
fun. That's fun for people to learn, because I've learned a lot of that from Kathy. Yeah, and that you carry that title with you, forever, which is kind of fun.
yes,
All right. So thank you. I agree with Kathy. That was a wonderful opening. We have a lot of young students on the show. So I would like to back up and just talk about, and then I have a more of a current question, but just to talk about and you did touch on it, but just to talk about the general structure of government. And
sure.
and you can, and I've asked every guest this because it's really intriguing to me. Federal government, from my understanding, means that you have a national government, and that it's shifted out. That you have the states, and that the federal government really means you have states involved. And you
Yes.
said the states started the government, but of course, really we the people, according to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution did too. The
Yes.
people within the states tell the government what to do. But I'd like for you to break down that that it's really a national government, isn't it? And the federalism is the states, or do we call the national government in DC the federal government? Because
So,
I still get very confused about that, and I haven't.
The very word
we haven't had a real clear
federal.
answer.
Yeah, the very word federal is speaking to your question. Federal is describing the national government, but it is the national government of a federation of states. And of course, under the Articles of Confederation, it was referred to awfully closely to that name, but the states retain their significance, and they're what's being referred to as the entire federation. The national government sits over it, but for the first 13 years of America's existence, we didn't have the Constitution. We operated as individual states for 13 years for everything, but we were still the United States of America. But what we've all, and everybody on here, has grown up with, the presumptions of the national government's role didn't exist in the beginning, didn't exist after the American Revolution. And it was bad enough for Washington trying to raise an army with no national government in the American Revolution. And then you got after that, after 1783, and they found all sorts of problems conducting business, commerce, which was really the inspiration for what became the Constitutional Convention. It was to fix the problems of commerce, was the motivating catalyst that got them together initially. Now, they wanted to attack all the problems in the Constitution, and they did their best to do that. But that's where that's what federal means. It really refers.
So should we refer to the DC and government as the national government or the federal government? Because I think a lot of times we say the federal government is when we're referring to DC, but really federal really means the states. So I think succinctly, like in 20 seconds, because I have many other questions and my time is kicking. Yep. I mean, what's the answer to that? Should we start referring to the government in DC as the national government?
I think technically national government would be correct. Yes, but we've grown up with the idea of calling it federal, like it's the representative of the states in some way, which it isn't anymore. It used to be, when the Senate wasn't popularly elected and when the states actually sent state representatives to the government, as opposed to being elected by the people directly. So for the first 120 years, it did have a federal component to it, meaning the states had actual state representatives in the federal government, which was the design of the Senate.
So I guess you could call DC the federal government then. I mean, because they're supposed to be that. Huh. Okay.
Custom and usage.
Yeah. All right. So, national government, and then, but I think another question that I'd like to hone in on a little bit, and you touched on it, is is that the founding fathers really intended for the states to have a lot more power than they have today. And
Yes.
I know you talked about the mandates and the money that the national government is saying, well, if you want this money, you have to abide by this. But it kind of goes both ways, doesn't it? The states want to accept that money, so they become willing.
Yes.
So it's kind of like this kind of goes both ways, doesn't it?
Yes, I would say it's a pretty bad habit. And the federal government, like, for example, won't let you out. Once you're in Medicaid and you get a federal match of dollars for your state dollars, you're not allowed to leave. Now, that part I have a real issue with. And that, your point, Janine, is absolutely correct. I jokingly tell people there's nothing uglier than putting a pot of money in front of a bunch of state legislators. They will trip over themselves no matter what the restrictions are to get it. And that just encourages the bankruptcy problem that I referred to earlier. We are an extremely bankrupt national government, to really an incredible degree mathematically. And that crash is coming. It's only a question of when. And the state's role in it is in essentially not restraining the federal government. One of the things that I do is I'm on a nonprofit board that is seeking to get a balanced budget amendment via the amendment process found in the Constitution and Article 5 of the Constitution. And the states have actually passed a lot of applications to do that. Again, this is another way states were given power to rein in the federal government, is by amending the Constitution. Well, 34 states crossed this threshold in 1979, and Congress didn't call the convention. Well, why might Congress not do that? Well, they don't want the states to get together and limit their power. But that's where that's the process the founders put in place. So I'm actually working on litigation on that very subject today. And it's part of that federalism balance between the state and federal government. It's one way the states can rein in the federal government.
So my phone rang in the middle of all that. Are you talking about calling a convention of states?
Yes.
Great. So many people don't know about that. And I think it's really one of the most fascinating checks and balances in our United States Constitution, which is there are two ways to amend the Constitution. I personally think amending the Constitution is one of the smartest things they ever put in that in our United States Constitution, because it could adapt to the times and still keep the structure of the checks and balances. It was really, really brilliant. But for those that don't know, that are listening, that are young, you can amend the Constitution through Congress, and all of them have been so far. Prohibition was a little tricky, but they have all been through Congress. But our founding fathers put in the Constitution that if Congress won't do it because they don't want to balance their budget, or they want to try to increase their pay or whatever it may be, the states can call a convention of states. And I think, in closing, because I need to pass here, but that's one of the great avenues of federalism, is it not? Where the states still have their power if they're not too lazy to do it, which is we can actually call our own convention and make an amendment to the Constitution if Congress won't do it itself. If the national government won't do it, the states can do it. And I think
Washington is scared to death of that. Yeah, they're scared to death of that power. So, for example, I talked about popularly elected senators. For those who don't recall your civics class, senators were sent to Washington by the states. The state legislatures picked their senators for the first 120 years of the U.S. Senate. That was by design. It was so the states literally had representatives in the federal government. And for those 120 years, this whole bribe the states and then make them do things didn't exist. Well, why not? Well, part of the reason was they had representatives there that kept it from happening very directly. Now, the idea of directly electing senators, by which I mean all of us voting for senators, was very popular. It gained popularity at the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s. And enough states sent applications for a convention, just like Janine was mentioning, they actually got over the threshold. Instead of calling the convention at that time, Congress went ahead itself and proposed the amendment, which then went back to the states, and 3/4 of them ratified it. And so we now have directly elected senators. So it has been
17th Amendment.
used by the states to force Washington to act, but they haven't gone to the point of actually having a convention. I'm trying to make that happen now to try to balance the
That'd be
budget,
really cool.
preserve all of your
Yeah.
futures, in my view, because I think it's a great threat to your future is the imbalance of our federal government.
Yeah, well, I need to pass to Tova, but that's really cool that you're doing that. A lot of people are afraid of that because they say it's going to cause a
They
big,
are.
new convention. But just so our students know, and then I need to, so like 10-second answer here, so Tova has time. That you need 2/3 of the states to call a convention, correct?
You need 2/3 to call a convention, but that doesn't get you the amendment. Then whatever comes out of the
But 3/4 have to ratify it.
3/4
Yeah,
need to
but in
ratify.
order to get to the state convention, you need 2/3 of the states. So how many do you have now?
Well, we argue that we passed 34. We got all the way up to 40 between 1979 and 1998, and nobody was keeping track, and Congress didn't call the convention. So our proposed lawsuit, we haven't filed it yet, is to say this happened, and so Congress is still under the obligation to call the convention. It's like committing a
interesting. That's
crime.
really
You can't unring the bell.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay, fascinating. Okay, I'm going to toss to Tova. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks, Janine. Those are some really interesting questions. So I wanted to talk a bit about we've discussed a lot about the relationship between the national government, which I now know how to say. So thank you for that, and the state governments. But I wanted to talk a bit about the relationship between the state and local governments. Last week we had on actually a mayor to talk about local government and all the work that they do. And I know that sometimes can be tension between local governments and
Sure.
state legislatures in particular. And particularly one contentious issue is on this idea of state preemption of local governments from the state legislature. So kind of my understanding of what that means, and feel free to correct me if you have a different understanding, is that preemption is the use of state law to nullify a municipal ordinance or authority. So kind of taking power from the local government to on certain issues and kind of giving it to the state legislature. So for instance, in 2023, and I'm not sure what the update on that is now, but the Texas legislature passed a measure which would prevent or preempt all local regulation of matters related to agriculture, business and commerce, finance, insurance, labor, national resources, occupations, and property code. And in 2023, that was awaiting the governor's signature. I'm not sure where that is now. But many of these measures kind of don't replace the local law with the state law, but rather just kind of are aimed to take away, bar local action on a certain issue. So I was curious, as someone who was a state senator, what do you think about this method of asserting state power? Kind of on a broad philosophical level, do you agree with that? And then why do you think we've seen an increase of that in recent years?
So Virginia is what is called a Dillon rule state. I used to know who Dillon was, but a Dillon rule state has preemption like you described. So a local government can only do what the state government allows it to do. And so let's take one step back in looking at this. We were talking about the national government. If you think about the US Constitution, the way the federal government was set up originally, and courts haven't always done this, but this was the idea, was that it can only do the tasks and have the authority delegated to it by the states in the Constitution. So James Madison actually argued we didn't need a Bill of Rights. He said, well, if the Constitution doesn't say the federal government can do something, then it can't. Well, we've seen from experience, it sort of grows its own power. Now, at the state level, state constitutions allow state governments, in Virginia's case, the state legislature, they have all powers except those blocked by their state constitution. So it's the reverse of the federal arrangement, but it is I would call it the basic level of sovereignty is the state. The states made the federal government, and the local governments are creatures of the states. So in Virginia, we have made and unmade counties and cities, for example. They don't have an independent right to exist separate from the state. The state gives them permission to exist. That's one level. And then you're talking about, okay, so they exist. Can they govern themselves free of interference from the state? And every state has some degree of preemption for the simple reason that they want consistency across the state. And I'll give you another example. Before most of you all were born, in Bush v. Gore, the election controversy of the year 2000, the 2000 election, Florida was counting ballots differently in different parts of the state. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You have to, Florida, you get to decide how to count your ballots, but you have to do it the same way everywhere, or it isn't fair. Fair is the regular word for due process. So elections are one example. A hot button one within states is, are we going to have the same gun laws everywhere, or are we going to let localities impose their own restrictions? Maybe cities want to do things differently than counties. In Virginia, we got rid of that 20 years ago. Other states have kept it. And it really is up to each state to decide how much preemption they're going to have and exercise. And I would say this, Tova, it isn't permanent. It can change even within a state. There aren't a lot of there are some elements of preemption that are preserved in states' constitutions. And of course, I always use Virginia as my example because I know it best. In Virginia, our school districts are preserved as independent from the state government. They have power that the state legislature can't invade because it's preserved in the state constitution. That's a little different from our usual way of operating, where the state government can dictate most anything to the local governments. And the variety of ways this is implemented across the country, if I had to count it, I would probably count 50. There's some wrinkle that every state brings into play here. And I get why a mayor wants to be able to have the freedom to lead wherever he or she wants to lead and however they want to do it. But when you run for office, you know what the boundaries are in your state. That's sort of part of the deal, if you will. And if you want to change those boundaries, well, don't run for mayor, run for the legislature and propose an amendment to your state constitution, because these things are not permanent, as I said, but they do serve purposes, and businesses like consistency. They don't like the rules to change every time they cross a city or county line or a township line, depending on where you live. And so consistency has other benefits as well.
Well, thank you so much. That was very clarifying to learn about state authority. But I'm curious, I think there's a difference between like what the states are able to do. And as you said, it's very up to the discretion of state legislatures
Right.
to what level of preemption they want to engage in. So I'm curious on a normative level, what do you think a good level of state preemption is? Should legislatures engage in that? Because I think it's interesting, the arguments you use of consistency, for instance, or a lot of the arguments that people in favor of preemption use could almost be flipped around and be used at the national level to challenge the authority of
Yes.
states. Like, for instance, saying that consistency is good across the state could be easily used by a proponent of national government power extension to say, oh, we want consistency across the states. Businesses operate across states. We should have consistency there. So I'm curious, kind of in your framework as somebody who's very pro state sovereignty, how you extend that argument and keep it consistent with having strong state authority over cities.
So you're correct. It is used at the national level as well. And as I mentioned, the impediments to commerce, to doing business, were the real catalyst for the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s. And the Commerce Clause says that states can't impose many burdens on commerce across state lines. So that's a decision the states made to restrict themselves for the benefit of economic opportunity for everyone. Within a state, I do think, you asked me my own views, I do think that business rules, as much as they can be uniform across a state, should be. I don't think it's necessarily a rationale that because I think it's such a good idea, we should impose it on the whole country. I feel strongly that shouldn't happen. Remember, many of our states are the size of countries. If you look at Florida or Texas or California, their economies, if they were countries, would rank in the top 10 or 15 in the world. And so there's a lot going on within any particular state. But things like economic rules, I think, should be the same. Rules of court. If I get sued in Richmond or I get sued in Northern Virginia, it shouldn't be different rules and different standards in different parts of the state for how I protect my legal rights within the state. I do think that laws that can result in criminal liability should be the same across a state. Gun laws are a good example of this. But that doesn't mean, one local government shouldn't be able to ban guns in their government building, for example, whereas their neighboring locality lets them come in. Those sorts of differences, if they're treated as civil matters, so maybe you could be guilty of trespassing, but that's not a criminal matter. You pay a fine, you have to leave the building, those kinds of things. Those sorts of things I'm comfortable with. I do think crimes, anything having to do with how the law is enforced and business restrictions should be the same across a state. I think for other things, the localities are sort of treated as property owners and property managers in charge of their area. Now, in Virginia, that Fairfax County has over 1 million people in it. That's a lot of people. But we do have counties that have as few as less than 10 or 20,000 people. They're going to operate a lot differently. We have felt our way to that comfort level in Virginia over the course of 400 years, because of course, Virginia predates the United States by a long time. And many of the states do, the original states certainly. And we have those histories of sort of feeling out what we're comfortable with. And people make decisions about where to live, in part, not exclusively, but by how things are run there. I would never, if I was going to leave Virginia, and of course I've set my roots here quite a bit, so it'd take a lot, but I wouldn't move to one of what I would consider to be the less free type of states. I would move to one of the ones where they make you make more of your own decisions on an individual basis, and where they're more protective of legal rights and so forth. So that's my normative answer, particularly in those areas of crime, court, and the economy. I think there should be consistency. I think we're all better served that way.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And now I'll pass on to Joel and Jordan for some more questions.
Super.
Hey, so I have a few part question. So our founding fathers set up our system, to have powers kind of compete so that no power can get
Yeah.
too strong and dominate, because they believe that if there's too much power in one place, it was going to corrupt whoever was wielding that power. We talk about that a lot on Constituting America, but today we're talking about the power of the states. So if that's true, then are states eroding powers, or their powers that they secede to the federal government, an issue? And if it's an issue, what are some ways? I know you talked about the one way with Janine earlier with the convention, but what are some ways that states need to kind of take some of that sovereignty back to themselves, and how important of an issue is it?
So awesome question, Joel. I think that the single biggest way states cede power to the federal government is they accept the money and they take the conditions that we talked about earlier. There's no question about it. Far and away, the biggest way they cede power to the federal government. And to get it back, I'm trying to help get it back with one of my other efforts with the Balanced Budget Convention that Janine and I were talking about. And that is a way states can get power back, is through that amendment process. And and they used to also be able to do it through the US Senate, but they can't do that anymore after the 17th Amendment changed the Senate from being a representative of the states as sovereign entities to being popularly elected like the House of Representatives. I think that was a bad idea. I think it was a mistake because it eroded the state's ability to check and rein in the federal government. And I don't mean any particular state or any particular view being accomplished. I simply mean the very balance that your question gets to. I think it took us out of balance. The Senate was one of the main ways to keep the federal government from gathering too much power to itself. And once that check from the states was gone, there really hasn't been much that's been very effective by the states. I mean, it's like going from a 9 in terms of effectiveness down to a 1. The lawsuits that I described doing when I was Attorney General, every Attorney General now does those around the country, targeted at what they think are federal excesses. But that is a really meager power relative to stopping it at the outset in the US Senate. Say when they're passing a budget or when they're passing a new federal law. If the states say, no, we're not gonna do this bribery deal where we have to say yes to all your bureaucrats' conditions to get your money. The Senate never let that happen when they represented the states, because what would happen if they did? Well, their state legislature would fire them. They'd pull them. They wouldn't be senators for very long. And in fact, that is what happened when state legislatures were displeased with their senators. They didn't return. The Lincoln Douglas debates weren't for them to be elected. People think about it in modern terms. They were campaigning for each of their party representatives. I guess at that time, Lincoln was a Whig, maybe a Republican, a Whig or a Republican, and Douglas was a Democrat. They were trying to get state legislators elected of their party who they supported, who would then elect them to the U.S. Senate.
Wow,
that's what was going on.
That's funny. I did it. We did that in I did that in one of my courses in college, and I don't even remember learning that, but that's crazy.
Better late than never.
We'll just sneak one more in before the audience questions. You had touched on that you think that states being so similar is almost a negative thing, that states should really have their own individuality.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, how do you think we could get back to a little bit more of that individuality? Because obviously we know when our country started, our states were widely different from each other. And when do you think was our golden age of states getting along while also having that individuality?
Yeah, that's a really good follow-up question. So I really believe that the states have tied themselves in so many federal knots by taking various forms of federal money. And it isn't take $1, you get all these things. It's transportation dollars, it's healthcare dollars, it's education, it's all sorts of little things on parts of our lives that touch everything that we do every day. And I really believe the key to getting state, we'll call it state individuality back, is to break the fetters of those spending restrictions. And that's going to require a balanced budget requirement where the federal government can't print money anymore. They're going to actually have to make decisions like the rest of us. Gee, I only have $1. And there are these two things for $1 I want to buy, but I can only buy one of them. Right now they say, well, I'll just print another $1. And, that takes away the necessity of prioritization. Prioritization is a valuable thing. I want them to spend the $1 on the thing we need more, not on both. I want them to have to make that decision. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe one of the ways that civility can be introduced back into our public discourse is to reduce the power of government, or at least push it down. Now, we'll reduce it overall if the federal government has to balance its budget, because there will be less money spent on government because they won't be able to print it every year. And that doesn't get state governments any more money. In fact, less money will flow to them, so they'll do less things. There'll be less to fight over. And I just think we'll be able to get along a little better. And there is still human nature to contend with. And then you ask the kind of the golden age of states getting along. That's a tough question to answer because of the context of everything else going on. The states weren't bound by the Bill of Rights until after the Civil War. The first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so forth amendments didn't apply to the states. It was the 14th Amendment's due process provision that was interpreted by the courts of applying all of the Bill of Rights effectively to the states. And now many states wrote the same rights or rights like that, right to jury, right to keep and bear arms, and so on, right to free speech, religion, into their own state constitutions. But they did it differently. And so then they didn't have the force of law before the Civil War. They had to just work together, and there were a lot more differences at that time. Now, now we also had slavery at that time, and so obviously that's the biggest single difference you'll have ever seen between any of our states. And it's hard to say that anything when that exists could be a best period for anything. I will say that as a constitutional matter for the states, not for the people, but for the states, they were freer to act before the Civil War and before the 14th Amendment. And part of what the Civil War did was it was the first time the federal government grew massively. After the Revolutionary War, our military was reduced to, this is not a typo, folks, 80 people. 80. And they were in two places, Fort Pitt and West Point. And they were just guarding the two armories. The states were left to defend their frontiers from the British and the Spanish and the French and Indians at that time. The states were expected to do that, much like the border states today could, if they wanted to, repel the invasion of illegal immigration across their southern borders. The states have the power to do that. And there literally was no federal personnel to do it for decades and decades. Then fast forward to the Civil War, it grows massively. First use of the income tax, massive sales of bonds, and other things. And they grew up. And then they had the freedmen's bureaus in the South after the Civil War. So that era is the first time you really saw a big, robust federal government. And it never really went away again. But they weren't they weren't dictating to the states, even after the Civil War, using the spending power I was describing. I'd probably put the answer to your question in the early 1900s, really before the full progressive era hit. The income tax and the Senate no longer represented states, but before World War I, probably that 10 or 15 years.
So
I've never been asked a question like that. That's a tough
great answer.
question.
You took it on instead of just blowing it off. That was an awesome answer. I know we have some audience questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. You guys ask good questions.
Thank you, Joel and Jorn and Tova and Janine. Great questions. And we do have some audience questions. Before we get to them, we want to give a shout out to our teachers and students that are watching today. We have D'Angela Hines with students from Emerald Coast Christian Academy, and we have Hope Mucklow with homeschool students. So welcome and thank you for joining us. We also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. KKVV airs these programs on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you, KKVV, for airing our Constitutional Chats podcast. So Secretary Cuccinelli, we have Robert Spiegler has a comment. Actually, this is for Janine. Thank you for the word about Northern Exposure. We are enjoying what I consider to be the most beautiful show on TV ever. So again, reminder that Northern Exposure is streaming on all Amazon platforms. We also, Secretary Cuccinelli had Mary Bowler said, we need civilized discussions in the way you provided. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
it's true.
So thank you for that. And when you're talking earlier about civic conversation, it's just so important.
Kathy, can I comment on that briefly? I mean,
Sure.
That's my desire, and I've told you some structural ways I think we can get there. But if you ever happen to have watched me, for instance, on CNN, you could say, wait a minute, this guy doesn't look like civility is his top priority. And I really believe the reason for the structures to move us in that direction are that until you get there, when you're engaged in a rhetorical contest, you're trying to convince people of something, that something is right or something is wrong. You have to meet people and your audience where they are, how they hear, how they listen, how they absorb information. And it can be very rough and tumble, which is why that structure that we operate within is so important, because it doesn't dictate how the discussions take place, but it sets the framework in such a way that I think we could improve it and have more civil discussion. I don't want people to be surprised if they hear me talking like this and then see me on television hammering away. I hammer away when I'm in a contest, and I look Italian, but I act Irish. I don't mind a good scrap. And I try to do it with a smile on my face, and constructively, but these are important issues that we debate and that we fight about. And the founders gave us a structure to fight within, and it is important that we stay within it. That's how that's how things happen peacefully. Even if it seems obnoxious, it needs to stay peaceful.
Oh, very true. And thank you. Bob Brewer says on February 8th, the Supreme Court of the United States gave us a 9-0 opinion abrogating the U.S. Department of Agriculture's sovereign immunity. Why has this not been reported? What impact might this have on sovereign immunity more broadly? Are you familiar with that one? Or
I am not, but I can answer the second part of it, is that there isn't anything legally or constitutionally unique about the Department of Agriculture versus some other department. And so whenever you find one department can be held liable, that's what abrogating sovereign immunity means. It means somebody could proceed with a lawsuit. Then the same can be true for any other department as well. There are limits to that: State Department, Defense Department. There are other restrictions that come into play, but it makes government subject to lawsuits by the people directly. And that can happen not just in the Department of Agriculture, but anywhere in the government.
Well, thank you. And we are right at the top of the hour, and we just so appreciate you being with us today. It was just a fascinating discussion. And thank you so much for sharing your time and for all of your service again to our Commonwealth of Virginia and to our country. And I want to just
Pleasure.
give Jewel and Joran and Tova a quick minute if y'all have any closing comments that you'd like to make.
Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great show.
Yeah, you guys ask awfully good questions, I got to tell you. And apparently from around the world, right, Tova? So
Well, thank you. And we'll invite our audience to come back and join us next week. We're going to be talking about national government as the conclusion of our federalism series. So thank you very much.